Introduction. Your best years are still ahead. What if I told you that everything you know about age is a lie? What if the years you're living right now, the ones you think might be too late, are actually the most powerful, most transformative years of your entire life? What if 40, 50, 60 or beyond isn't the end of possibility, but the beginning of the truest, most authentic version of yourself you've ever been? You've probably been living with a quiet fear. Maybe it whispers to you at 3 in the morning when you can't sleep. Maybe it hits you when you look in the mirror and wonder, who is this person staring back at me? Maybe it showed up the day you realized you've been living someone else's life for so long, you can't even remember what your own dreams look like anymore. The fear has a simple question. Is it too late? Too late to change careers? Too late to find love again? Too late to pursue that dream you buried decades ago? Too late to start over and become who you were always meant to be? Here's the truth that no one has told you. It's not too late. It's never too late. And the life you've been waiting for permission to live? It's waiting for you right now. But here's what's really happening. Society has sold you a script, a timeline, a set of rules about what you're supposed to accomplish by certain ages. And if you haven't checked those boxes, you've somehow failed. You were supposed to have it all figured out by 30. You were supposed to be settled, successful, secure by 40. And if you're past that, and still searching, still questioning, still feeling lost, well, you must have missed your chance. That script is a lie, and this book exists to burn it to the ground. Because the most extraordinary reinventions, the most powerful transformations, the most authentic lives, they don't happen in your 20s when you're still figuring out who you are. They happen later. They happen when you've lived enough to know what matters. When you've tried enough to know what doesn't. When you've accumulated the wisdom, the courage, and the scars that only experience can give you. Vera Wang didn't design her first dress until she was 40. Colonel Sanders didn't start KFC until he was 62. Morgan Freeman didn't get his breakthrough role until he was 50. Martha Stewart built an empire in her 40s, lost it all, and rebuilt it again. These aren't exceptions. They're proof that your best work, your truest self, your greatest chapter, it doesn't come at the beginning. It comes when you're ready. And if you're reading this, you're ready. In this book, you won't find a 30-day program. You won't find a step-by-step system with scientific formulas and productivity hacks. What you will find is something far more powerful. Permission, stories, hope, and a roadmap. Not to becoming someone new, but to rediscovering who you've always been underneath all the roles, expectations, and fears that have buried you. You'll meet people like Sarah, who at 47 left a career that was suffocating her soul. You'll hear about Michael, who at 52 finally asked himself, who am I without my role? And found an answer that changed everything. You'll discover why the courage to start small is more powerful than any grand plan, and why the people who truly understand you will only find you once you become yourself. This book will show you how to let go of who you were supposed to be and embrace who you actually are. It will teach you how to give yourself the permission you've been waiting for. It will help you wake up excited about your life again, not someday, but starting today. And most importantly, it will prove to you, with real stories, real transformations, and real hope, that your story isn't over. It's just beginning. Because here's what I know to be true. The best years of your life aren't behind you. They're ahead of you. And they start the moment you decide to stop waiting and start living. So let me ask you one question before we begin. Are you ready to find yourself again? If the answer is yes, turn the page. Your new chapter starts now. Chapter 1. The Myth of Too Late. Let me tell you about a woman named Vera Wang. At 40 years old, Vera had never designed a single wedding dress. She'd spent 2 decades as a fashion editor at Vogue, then worked in design at Ralph Lauren. But at 40, she was standing at a crossroads, wondering if she'd missed her chance to do something truly her own. Everyone around her had an opinion. "You're starting now?" they said. "At your age?" The implication was clear. If you haven't made it by 40, you've missed the boat. Vera didn't listen. She designed her first dress at 40. Today, her name is synonymous with wedding fashion. Her designs have dressed celebrities, royalty, and millions of brides around the world. She didn't just succeed, she became a legend. And she did it at an age when society told her she should be winding down, not ramping up. Now let me ask you something. What would have happened if Vera had believed them? What if she'd looked at her age and said, "You're right, it's too late"? The world would have lost one of its most iconic designers, and Vera would have spent the rest of her life wondering, what if? Here's the uncomfortable truth. The myth of too late is the single most destructive lie our culture tells us. It's a story we've internalized so deeply, we don't even question it anymore. We just accept it as fact. By 30, you should have it figured out. By 40, you should be settled. By 50, you should be coasting toward retirement. And if you're past those markers and still searching, still restless, still dreaming, well, you've somehow failed. But here's what that myth doesn't tell you. The greatest achievements, the deepest transformations, the most authentic lives, they rarely happen when you're young. They happen when you've lived long enough to know who you are, when you've tried enough to know what matters, when you've failed enough to know that failure isn't the end of the story. It's just part of it. The myth of too late isn't based on reality. It's based on fear. Fear that keeps you small. Fear that keeps you stuck. Fear that keeps you living someone else's version of your life instead of your own. And it's time to destroy that myth once and for all. Think about it. When you were 25, did you really know yourself? Did you understand what brought you joy? What drained your energy? What you were willing to sacrifice for and what you absolutely weren't? Probably not. You were still trying on identities like clothes, still figuring out what fit. That's not a criticism. That's just the truth of being young. You're supposed to be trying, experimenting, stumbling. But by the time you reach 40, 50, or beyond, something shifts. You've accumulated something far more valuable than youth. You've gained wisdom, perspective, self-knowledge. You know what you're good at. You know what makes you come alive. You know what relationships nourish you and which ones drain you. You know the difference between what society says you should want and what you actually want. That's not a deficit. That's a superpower. And yet, the myth of too late tries to convince you otherwise. It tells you that youth is everything. That if you haven't made it by a certain age, you never will. That your best days are behind you, and all you can do now is accept your lot and make peace with regret. What a tragic, limiting, soul-crushing lie. Let me introduce you to Jane. She's not famous. She's not on magazine covers. But her story matters just as much as Vera Wang's. Jane spent 23 years as a high school English teacher. She loved her students, but somewhere along the way, the job stopped feeding her soul. The bureaucracy, the standardized tests, the endless meetings. It all started to feel like it was crushing the very thing that made her love teaching in the first place. The joy of connecting with young minds and helping them discover their own voices. At 47, Jane looked at herself in the mirror one morning and realized she was exhausted. Not physically tired, though she was that too, but exhausted in her soul. She'd spent so many years pouring herself into a system that no longer aligned with who she was, and she couldn't do it anymore. But she was terrified. She had a mortgage. She had 2 kids in college. She had 23 years invested in her pension. And she had a voice in her head that whispered the same thing over and over. It's too late. You can't start over now. You've missed your chance. For 6 months, Jane lived in that tension. The pull toward something new, something true, battling against the fear of too late. And then one day, she made a choice. She decided that living the next 20 years the way she'd lived the last 20 was a fate worse than any risk she could take. Jane left teaching. She started small, tutoring students one-on-one, then offering writing workshops from her living room. Within 2 years, she'd built a thriving business, helping teenagers find their voice through creative writing. She didn't make as much money as she had as a teacher, not at first. But when I asked her if she regretted it, she looked at me like I'd asked if she regretted breathing. "Regret leaving?" she said. "I regret not doing it sooner." Jane is 49 now. She wakes up excited about her work. She feels alive again. And she's proof that too late is a myth we tell ourselves out of fear, not truth. So where does this myth come from? Why do we believe it so deeply? Part of it is cultural. We live in a society obsessed with youth. We celebrate child prodigies, 20-something CEOs, athletes who peak in their 20s. We act like life is a race, and if you're not ahead by a certain age, you've lost. But that's not how life works. Life isn't a race with a finish line. It's a journey with chapters. And some of the best chapters don't come until later. Part of it is also fear of judgment. We're terrified of what people will think if we make a big change later in life. What will they say if I go back to school at 50? What will my family think if I leave my stable job? What if people laugh at me for trying something new at this age? Here's the hard truth. Some people will judge you. Some people will think you're crazy. Some people will tell you you're making a mistake. But those people? They're living their own fear. They're projecting their own too-late story onto you. And their opinion has nothing to do with your truth. The people who truly love you, who truly see you, they'll support you. And the people who don't? They were never your people to begin with. But perhaps the deepest root of the too late myth is this. We've been conditioned to believe that change is only possible when you're young. That reinvention is for 20-somethings, not for people with mortgages and responsibilities and gray hair. That once you've chosen a path, you're stuck on it. That's not just wrong, it's tragic. Because the truth is, you're never stuck. You're only stuck if you believe you're stuck. And the moment you realize that belief is just a story you've been telling yourself, not a fact, not a law, not a reality, everything changes. Think about it. What does too late even mean? Too late for what? Too late according to whom? Too late based on what timeline? If you're alive, you're not too late. If you're breathing, you're not too late. If you have today, you're not too late. Colonel Sanders was 62 when he started franchising Kentucky Fried Chicken. 62. He'd failed at multiple businesses. He was broke. He was living on Social Security, and he had a recipe for fried chicken and a dream. That's it. No money, no connections, no safety net. Just belief that it wasn't too late. He died a multimillionaire. His face is on restaurants all over the world. And he didn't even start until most people are thinking about retirement. If he can do that at 62, what's your excuse? I'm not saying it's easy. Starting over, whether it's a career, a relationship, a dream you buried, is never easy, regardless of age. But here's what I am saying. It's possible. And the idea that it's too late is the only thing standing between you and the life you actually want to live. The myth of too late is designed to keep you safe, to keep you small, to keep you from taking risks. Because if you never try, you never fail. And if you never fail, you never have to face the discomfort of not knowing how things will turn out. But safety isn't the same thing as happiness. Staying small isn't the same thing as peace. And avoiding risk isn't the same thing as living. You weren't put on this earth to play it safe until you die. You were put here to become yourself, to discover what lights you up, to create, to love, to contribute, to live in a way that feels true to who you are. And that doesn't have an expiration date. So here's what I want you to understand. The years you've lived aren't a countdown to an ending. They're a foundation for a beginning. Every experience you've had, every mistake you've made, every joy and heartbreak and lesson learned, that's not wasted time. That's preparation. You're not too late. You're right on time. And your story is just getting started. Chapter 2. Who are you without your role? Here's a question most people spend their entire lives avoiding. Who are you when you take away all the titles, all the roles, all the identities you've built? Not what do you do, not what's your job, not who are you married to or whose parent are you? But who are you at your core when everything else is stripped away? For most of us, that question is terrifying. Because we've spent decades building our identity around our roles. We are the accountant. We are the mother. We are the reliable one, the successful one, the one everyone depends on. And those roles? They've become so tightly woven into who we think we are that we can't tell where the role ends and we begin. But here's what happens when you hit your 40s, your 50s, or beyond. Those roles start to shift. Your kids grow up and leave home. Your job changes or loses its meaning. Your marriage evolves or ends. And suddenly, you're standing there, looking in the mirror, asking a question you never thought you'd have to answer. Who am I without all of this? Let me tell you about Michael. Michael was 52 when we met. And he was in the middle of what he called the unraveling. For 30 years, he'd been a lawyer. A good lawyer. The kind of lawyer who worked 70-hour weeks, who made partner young, who built a reputation and a life around being the guy who got things done. His identity was so wrapped up in his work that when people asked who he was, the answer was immediate. I'm a lawyer. But at 52, something shifted. It wasn't burnout, though he was burned out. It wasn't a specific crisis, though there were plenty of stressful moments. It was something deeper, something he couldn't quite name. He woke up one morning and realized he didn't recognize himself anymore. He'd spent 3 decades being a lawyer, being a husband, being a father. But who was he? Who was Michael underneath all of that? I felt like I'd been playing a character my whole life, he told me. And I was so good at playing that character that I forgot I was acting. Michael's story isn't unique. It's universal, especially for people in their 40s and beyond. Because by the time you reach this stage of life, you've spent years building an identity. You've collected roles like badges: parent, spouse, professional, caretaker, provider. And those roles, they matter. They give you purpose, structure, a sense of who you are in the world. But here's the problem. When your identity is entirely built on external roles, what happens when those roles change? When your kids don't need you the same way anymore, are you still a parent? When your career stops fulfilling you, are you still defined by your job? When your relationship changes, who are you without that partner? The answer, for too many people, is terrifying silence. This is the crisis of identity that hits hardest in midlife. It's not just about aging. It's about realizing that the life you've been living might not be your life at all. It might be the life you were supposed to live, the life your parents wanted for you, the life society told you was success, the life you built to meet everyone else's expectations. But it's not yours. And the moment you realize that, the moment you ask, who am I without my role, everything changes. Let me be clear. This isn't about abandoning your responsibilities. It's not about walking away from your family or quitting your job and moving to Bali. It's about something far more profound. It's about discovering the person you've always been underneath all the roles you've played. Because here's the truth. You are not your job. You are not your relationship status. You are not defined by how much money you make, what car you drive, or how successfully you've checked the boxes society handed you. You are something deeper, something truer, something that's been waiting, quietly, for you to remember. But finding that person, that requires courage. Because it means facing the uncomfortable truth that maybe, just maybe, you've been living someone else's version of your life instead of your own. Michael didn't have an answer to the question, who are you, when he first asked it. And that scared him. For weeks, he sat with that discomfort, with the unsettling feeling of not knowing. But slowly, he started to pay attention to the moments when he felt most alive. Not when he was winning a case or impressing a client, but when he was alone in his woodshop on Saturday mornings, building furniture with his hands, when he was having deep conversations with his daughter about her dreams, when he was hiking in silence, with no agenda, no performance, no one to impress. Those moments, the ones he dismissed as hobbies or downtime, those were the moments when he was being himself, not the lawyer, not the role, but Michael. And when he started paying attention to those moments, everything began to shift. Here's what I want you to understand. Your roles are real. Your responsibilities are real. But they are not the totality of who you are. They're what you do, but they're not who you are. And the sooner you understand that distinction, the sooner you can start living as yourself, not as a performance. Think about it. How much of your life is driven by what other people expect from you? How much of your identity is built on being what someone else needs you to be? If you're a parent, how much of your sense of self is wrapped up in being needed by your kids? And what happens when they grow up and don't need you the same way anymore? Do you lose yourself? If you're defined by your career, what happens when that career ends, or stops fulfilling you, or disappears in a layoff? Do you become nothing? If your marriage is the cornerstone of your identity, what happens if that relationship changes? Do you cease to exist? These aren't hypothetical questions. They're real. And for people in their 40s, 50s, and beyond, they're the questions that keep you up at 3 a.m. Let me introduce you to Rachel. Rachel was 45 when her youngest child left for college. For 23 years, her entire life had revolved around being a mother. She loved being a mother. It was the most important thing she'd ever done. But when her son drove away that September morning, Rachel walked back into her empty house and felt a wave of panic she couldn't explain. Who am I now? She thought. If I'm not needed as a mom every single day, what am I for? Rachel had what psychologists call an identity foreclosure. Her sense of self was so tightly bound to one role that when that role changed, she didn't know who she was anymore. For months, Rachel struggled. She felt lost, unmoored, purposeless. But slowly, she started asking herself different questions. Not, what do I do? But what do I love? Not who needs me, but what makes me come alive? And what she discovered surprised her. She'd always loved photography, but she'd put it aside when the kids were young. She'd always been curious about art history, but there was never time. She'd always wanted to travel to Italy, but it wasn't practical. Those weren't just hobbies. They were clues, breadcrumbs leading her back to herself. Rachel didn't stop being a mother, but she stopped being only a mother. She enrolled in an art history course. She picked up her camera again. She started planning that trip to Italy. And slowly, she started to feel like a person again. Not just a role, but a person with desires, interests, and a life that was hers. When I asked her what changed, she said something I'll never forget. I realized that being a good mother didn't mean disappearing. It meant being a whole person, so my kids could learn what that looks like. Here's the uncomfortable truth. Most of us have spent our lives trying to be good at our roles. We want to be good parents, good employees, good partners. And that's admirable. But in the process of trying to be good at those roles, we've forgotten to be good at being ourselves. We've forgotten to ask, what do I want? We've forgotten to notice what brings us joy. We've forgotten that we're allowed to exist outside of being useful to other people. And that forgetting, it's costly. Because when you don't know who you are outside your roles, you become fragile, brittle, dependent on external validation to feel like you matter. And when those roles inevitably shift, because they will shift, you're left with nothing. But here's the good news. It's not too late to remember. It's not too late to ask, who am I? And actually wait for an answer. It's not too late to pay attention to the moments when you feel most alive and follow them like breadcrumbs. It's not too late to become the person you've always been underneath all the performance. In fact, this stage of life, this moment when your roles are shifting, is the perfect time to ask that question. Because you finally have the wisdom, the perspective, and the courage to answer it honestly. You don't need permission to exist outside your roles. You don't need to earn the right to have desires, dreams, or a life that's yours. You already have that right. You've always had it. You just forgot. So here's what I want you to do. Stop for a moment. Put down the list of responsibilities. Turn off the voice that says, "But I should be." And ask yourself this. Who am I when no one is watching? What do I love when I'm not trying to be useful? What makes me feel alive? The answers might not come immediately. And that's okay, because the question itself is revolutionary. The question itself is the beginning of finding your way back to yourself. Michael is still a lawyer. Rachel is still a mother. But they're also themselves now. And that changes everything. Because when you know who you are underneath the roles, you stop living in fear of those roles changing. You stop clinging to identities that no longer fit. You stop performing and start living. And that, more than anything, is what it means to start over. Not abandoning who you've been, but remembering who you've always been. So who are you without your role? It's the most important question you'll ever answer. And your future is waiting on the other side of it. Chapter 3. The permission you've been waiting for. Let me tell you about a man who changed the world at an age when most people are thinking about slowing down. His name was Harlan Sanders. You probably know him better as Colonel Sanders. At 62 years old, Sanders was broke. He'd failed at multiple businesses. His restaurant had just gone under. He was living on a $105 Social Security check. Most people at that age would have given up, accepted their fate, and quietly resigned themselves to a modest retirement. But Sanders had something most people don't have. He refused to wait for permission. He had a recipe for fried chicken that he believed in. So he got in his car and started driving. He went from restaurant to restaurant, cooking his chicken for owners, trying to convince them to buy his recipe. He was rejected over 1,000 times. 1,000 times, someone told him no. 1,000 times, someone looked at this 62-year-old man and thought, who does he think he is? But he didn't wait for anyone to tell him it was okay to try. He didn't wait for society's approval. He didn't wait for the right time or the right circumstances. He gave himself permission, and that changed everything. Today, KFC has over 25,000 locations worldwide. Sanders became a multimillionaire. His face is one of the most recognizable in the world. And he didn't even start until most people would have already given up. Now let me ask you something. What are you waiting for permission to do? What dream, what change, what version of yourself are you holding back because you haven't gotten the approval you think you need? Are you waiting for your parents to finally understand, for your spouse to support you, for your kids to be okay with it, for society to tell you it's acceptable? For someone, anyone, to look at you and say, yes, you have permission to become who you want to be? Here's the truth you need to hear. That permission is never coming. At least not from the people you're waiting to hear it from. Because the permission you're waiting for isn't something someone else can give you. It's something you have to give yourself. And that's the hardest, most liberating thing you'll ever do. Think about it. From the time you were a child, you've been conditioned to seek permission. Permission from your parents to make choices. Permission from teachers to speak. Permission from society to pursue certain paths. Permission from your boss to take time off. Permission from your partner to have needs. You've spent your entire life asking, is this okay? Am I allowed? Will you be upset if I? And somewhere along the way, you internalize the belief that you need external validation to make changes in your own life. But here's what no one tells you. The people you're waiting for permission from, they're living their lives. They're making choices based on their fears, their desires, their comfort zones. And asking them for permission to live your life is like asking a fish for permission to climb a tree. It doesn't make sense, and it will never work. Let me introduce you to Sarah. Sarah was 44 years old when she realized her marriage was over. Not over in the dramatic, explosive sense. There was no affair, no betrayal. It was over in the quieter, more painful way. They'd grown into different people. They wanted different things, and staying together meant staying small. But Sarah couldn't bring herself to leave. Not because she didn't want to, but because she was waiting for permission. Permission from her parents, who believed divorce was failure. Permission from her kids, who she thought needed an intact family. Permission from her friends, who envied her stable marriage. Permission from someone to tell her it was okay to choose herself. For 2 years, she waited. And in those 2 years, she felt herself disappearing. The person she was, the person she wanted to be, was being slowly erased by the person she thought she was supposed to be. And then, one day, something shifted. She was sitting in her car in a parking lot. Why do so many awakenings happen in parking lots? And she realized no one was going to give her permission. Her parents would never approve. Her kids would never say, "Yes, Mom, leave Dad." Her friends would never understand. She could wait forever for permission that would never come. Or she could give it to herself. So she did. Sarah didn't abandon her responsibilities. She didn't act recklessly. But she stopped waiting for someone else to tell her it was okay to want a different life. She filed for divorce. She found her own apartment. She started living as the person she'd been hiding for 20 years. And you know what happened? Her parents were upset. Her kids were confused. Her friends whispered. But Sarah started breathing again. "I spent so long waiting for permission," she told me, "that I forgot I was the only person who could give it to myself. Here's what I want you to understand. The permission you're waiting for isn't about other people. It's about you. It's about whether you're willing to give yourself permission to want something different, to need something different, to be something different. And that's terrifying. Because when you give yourself permission, you also take on responsibility. You can't blame anyone else if it doesn't work out. You can't hide behind, "Well, they said it was okay." You have to own your choices. And that's scary. But it's also the only path to freedom. Think about all the permissions you've been waiting for. Permission to change careers. Permission to pursue a dream. Permission to leave a relationship that's draining you. Permission to move to a new city. Permission to try something and maybe fail. Permission to prioritize yourself instead of always being last on the list. And now think about this. What if you never get that permission from the people you're waiting to hear it from? What if your parents never approve? What if your partner never supports you? What if your friends never understand? Will you spend the rest of your life waiting? Or will you give yourself the permission you need? Here's the uncomfortable truth. Most people will never give you permission to outgrow them. Parents won't give you permission to live differently than they did. Partners won't give you permission to want more than they can give. Friends won't give you permission to change when they're comfortable with who you've been. That's not because they're bad people. It's because they're human. They're scared of losing you. They're scared of being left behind. They're scared of what your changes mean for their lives. But their fear doesn't get to dictate your future. Colonel Sanders didn't wait for anyone to tell him it was okay to start KFC at 62. Vera Wang didn't wait for permission to become a designer at 40. And you don't have to wait either. But here's where it gets tricky. Giving yourself permission doesn't mean being reckless. It doesn't mean ignoring your responsibilities or acting impulsively. It means being honest with yourself about what you want, and then figuring out how to move toward that. Even if it's slow, even if it's messy, even if no one else understands. Sarah didn't leave her marriage overnight. She took time. She went to therapy. She made sure her kids were supported. But she stopped waiting. And that made all the difference. Because waiting for permission is just another way of staying stuck. Let me ask you this. What would you do if you knew you had permission? If you knew it was okay to want more, to try something new, to become someone different? What would you do? Would you go back to school? Would you leave that job that's been draining you for years? Would you finally write that book, start that business, take that trip? Would you have the hard conversation you've been avoiding? Would you choose yourself, even if it disappoints someone else? The answer to that question is who you really are. The person underneath all the waiting, all the fear, all the need for approval. And that person? They don't need anyone's permission. They just need yours. Here's what giving yourself permission looks like in practice. It's waking up one day and saying, I don't need my parents to understand. I just need to be honest with myself. It's looking at your partner and saying, I love you, but I also need to love myself. And that means making changes. It's telling your kids, I'm not abandoning you by becoming myself. I'm showing you what it looks like to live authentically. It's saying to yourself, I don't need to wait for the perfect moment. I don't need everyone's approval. I just need to take one step toward the life I actually want. That's not selfish. That's self-preservation. That's choosing to live instead of just exist. And here's the beautiful thing. Once you give yourself permission, you'll be amazed at how much less you need it from anyone else. Because you'll realize that the only approval that ever mattered was your own. Sarah is 50 now. She's been divorced for 6 years. Her parents still don't fully approve. Her kids are still adjusting. But Sarah, she's alive. She's building a life that's hers, and she wouldn't trade that for all the approval in the world. Because she learned what Colonel Sanders knew. The only permission you need is the permission you give yourself. So here's what I'm asking you to do. Stop waiting. Stop looking for someone to tell you it's okay. Stop putting your life on hold until everyone around you is comfortable with your choices. Give yourself permission, not someday. Not when it's easier. Not when everyone agrees. Now. Permission to want more. Permission to try and fail. Permission to disappoint people. Permission to choose yourself. Permission to become who you've always been underneath all the roles and expectations. You don't need anyone else to say yes. You just need to stop saying no to yourself. Your life is yours, and you're the only one who can give yourself permission to live it. So what are you waiting for? Chapter 4. Letting go of who you were supposed to be. There's a version of you that exists only in your imagination. A version that your parents dreamed of. A version that society expected. A version that you thought you were supposed to become. The successful executive. The devoted spouse. The perfect parent. The person who had it all figured out by 35. The one who checked every box, climbed every ladder, and made everyone proud. That person is not you. They've never been you. And the sooner you let them go, the sooner you can start living as the person you actually are. But letting go of who you were supposed to be, it is one of the hardest, most painful things you'll ever do. Because it means grieving a life you never lived. Mourning a version of yourself that never existed. And accepting that all those years spent trying to become that person. They weren't wasted. But they also weren't yours. David was 50 years old when he finally admitted something he'd been running from his entire life. He didn't want to be a doctor. He'd become a doctor. He'd spent 4 years in medical school, years in residency, decades building a practice. He was good at it. Respected, well paid, everything his parents had hoped for, everything society said meant success. But he hated it, not because medicine was bad, but because it wasn't his. It was the dream his father had for him, the path his mother had pushed him toward, the identity he'd built to make other people proud. And somewhere along the way, he'd forgotten to ask himself what he actually wanted. At 50, David stood in his office, looked at the diplomas on the wall, diplomas that represented decades of his life, and felt nothing. Not pride, not satisfaction, just exhaustion. And the quiet, devastating realization that he'd spent his entire life becoming someone he was never meant to be. I felt like I'd been living someone else's life, he told me. And the worst part was that I was good at it. I was successful at being the wrong person. Here's the truth most people don't want to face. You've probably spent years, maybe decades, trying to become the person you thought you were supposed to be. And that person might look nothing like who you actually are. You became the responsible one because your family needed you to be. You chose the stable career because that's what success was supposed to look like. You stayed in the relationship because leaving would mean admitting you'd made a mistake. You built a life that looks good on paper but feels empty in your soul. And now, at 40, 50, or beyond, you're finally asking the question you should have asked 20 years ago. Is this who I want to be? And the answer, quietly, terrifyingly, is no. But here's where it gets complicated. You can't just erase the person you've been. You can't undo the choices you've made. You can't get back the years you spent building a life that wasn't yours. So what do? You grieve. You let yourself feel the loss of who you were supposed to be. And then you make peace with it. Because you can't move forward while you're still clinging to a version of yourself that never existed. Marina was 48 when she realized she'd spent her entire life trying to be the daughter her immigrant parents wanted. The one who went to college. The one who got the respectable job. The one who made them proud after everything they'd sacrificed. And she had done all those things. She'd become a teacher, married a good man, bought a house in a safe neighborhood. She'd done everything right, but she'd also buried the parts of herself that didn't fit the script. The part that wanted to travel, to create art, to live freely instead of safely. She'd spent 25 years being the good daughter, the good wife, the good teacher. And in the process, she'd lost herself. At 48, Marina made a decision that shocked everyone who knew her. She quit her job, sold her house, and moved to Mexico to teach art to local children. Her parents were devastated. Her husband left her. Her friends thought she'd lost her mind. But Marina, for the first time in her life, felt like she could breathe. I spent so many years trying to be who they needed me to be, she told me, that I forgot I had a choice. I forgot I was allowed to want something different. Marina's story isn't about abandoning responsibility. It's about finally choosing herself after decades of choosing everyone else. It's about letting go of the person she was supposed to be and embracing the person she actually was. Letting go required grieving. She had to grieve the relationship with her parents that would never be the same. She had to grieve the marriage that ended because her husband wanted the old Marina, not the real one. She had to grieve the years she'd spent building a life that looked good but felt hollow. But on the other side of that grief, there was freedom. Here's what most people don't understand about letting go. It's not about erasing who you've been. It's about making peace with the fact that who you've been wasn't who you were. It was who you thought you should be. And those are two very different things. Think about all the expectations you've internalized over the years. Your parents' dreams for you. Society's definition of success. The timeline you thought you were supposed to follow. The boxes you thought you needed to check. How many of those were yours? How many of those were choices you made because you wanted them, not because someone else expected them? If you're honest with yourself, the answer is probably not many. And that's not your fault. You were conditioned to become the person others wanted you to be. From childhood, you were taught that love is conditional, that approval is earned, that your worth is measured by how well you meet other people's expectations. So you spent your life performing, playing the role, becoming the person you thought you were supposed to be. And somewhere along the way, you lost track of who you actually were. But here's the beautiful, terrifying truth. It's not too late to let that person go. David, the doctor who realized at 50 that he didn't want to be a doctor, didn't quit medicine overnight. But he did start asking himself what he actually wanted. And slowly, he began making changes. He cut back his hours. He started spending more time in his wood shop, something he'd loved as a teenager but had abandoned for medical school. He began volunteering at a local community center, teaching kids basic carpentry. And for the first time in decades, he felt like himself. He's still a doctor. But he's no longer just a doctor. He's David, a man who happens to practice medicine, but who is so much more than that. That shift, from being defined by his role to being defined by himself, changed everything. Here's what letting go of who you were supposed to be looks like in practice. It's admitting to yourself that the life you built doesn't fit anymore. That the person you've been trying to be isn't who you are. It's giving yourself permission to grieve that, to feel sad, angry, frustrated, or lost. Because letting go of who you were supposed to be is a loss, even if that person was never real. It's forgiving yourself for the years you spent trying to become someone else. Because you were doing the best you could with the knowledge you had. And it's choosing today to start living as who you actually are. Not who your parents wanted, not who society expected, not who you thought you were supposed to be. But you, the real, messy, imperfect, authentic you. That doesn't mean you have to blow up your life. Marina moved to Mexico. But that's not the only path. David stayed in medicine but changed how he practiced. Sarah left her marriage. But you might stay in yours and just change the dynamics. Letting go of who you were supposed to be doesn't require a dramatic upheaval. It just requires honesty with yourself about what you want, about who you are, about what actually matters to you, not to everyone else. And here's the hardest part. When you let go of who you were supposed to be, you also have to let go of the people who loved that version of you. Some people won't understand. Some people won't like it. Some people will try to pull you back into the role you played because they were comfortable with that version of you. And you'll have to choose. Do I stay small to keep them comfortable? Or do I become myself, even if it means losing them? That's a painful choice. But it's also the only choice that leads to freedom. Marina lost her parents' approval. She lost her marriage. But she gained herself. And for her, that was worth it. David lost some colleagues who thought he was wasting his potential. But he gained a life that felt true. And for him, that was worth it. What about you? What are you willing to lose in order to become yourself? Because here's the truth. You can't have both. You can't keep living as the person you were supposed to be and become the person you actually are. One of them has to go. And I'm asking you to choose you. Not someday. Not when it's easier. Not when everyone approves. Now. Choose to let go of the version of yourself that never existed. Choose to grieve the life you didn't live. Choose to forgive yourself for the years you spent trying to be someone else. And then choose to move forward, not as who you were supposed to be, but as who you actually are. That person has been waiting for you your whole life, and they're ready to live. So let them. Chapter 5. The courage to start small. We've been taught to worship the big moment, the grand gesture, the dramatic transformation. The day you quit your job, sell everything, and move to another country. The moment you finally make the change you've been dreaming about for years. But here's what no one tells you. Most real transformations don't happen in one dramatic leap. They happen in 1,000 small steps. in tiny, almost invisible choices made over and over again, in moments so quiet that no one else even notices them. And that's not weakness, that's wisdom. Because the truth is, at 40, 50, or beyond, you don't need a dramatic upheaval to change your life. What you need is the courage to start where you are, to take one small step, and then another, and then another. That's not as sexy as burning everything down and starting over. But it's far more sustainable, far more realistic, and far more likely to actually work. Emily was 46 when she realized she'd lost herself completely. She'd spent the last 20 years being a mother, a wife, a project manager at a company that drained her soul. She woke up, got the kids ready, went to work, came home, made dinner, helped with homework, fell into bed exhausted, and did it all over again the next day. There was no space for her, no time to think, to breathe, to remember who she even was outside of all those roles. And she was drowning. She knew she needed to change something. But the idea of making a big change, quitting her job, leaving her marriage, completely reinventing her life, felt impossible. She had bills to pay, kids who needed her, responsibilities that weren't going away. So instead of waiting for the perfect moment to make a dramatic change, Emily did something radical. She started small. She set her alarm for 6 in the morning, 30 minutes before anyone else in her house woke up. And in those 30 minutes, she sat on her back porch with a cup of coffee and did nothing. No phone, no to-do list, no solving anyone else's problems. Just her, breathing, existing, remembering what it felt like to be alone with her own thoughts. It doesn't sound like much, 30 minutes a day. But for Emily, it was revolutionary. Because for the first time in 20 years, she had space. Space to ask herself what she wanted. Space to notice how she felt. Space to reconnect with the person she'd been before she became everyone else's everything. Those 30 minutes changed everything for her. Here's what happened. In those quiet mornings, Emily started to remember things about herself she'd forgotten. She remembered that she used to love writing. Not for work, not for anyone else, just for herself. So she started bringing a journal to her porch. Just a few sentences at first, then a page, then more. She remembered that she used to love hiking. So she started waking up even earlier on Saturdays, just once a month at first, and going to a nearby trail by herself. No kids, no husband, just her and the trees and the silence. She remembered that she used to have dreams, not big, audacious, change-the-world dreams, just small, personal ones, like writing a book someday, like traveling to Ireland, like learning to paint. And slowly, over months and years, Emily started building a life that had room for those dreams. Not by quitting her job or leaving her marriage or making any grand, irreversible decisions, but by taking small steps, by carving out tiny pockets of time for herself, by honoring the person she was becoming, not just the roles she'd been playing. Today, Emily is 51. She's still married, she's still working. Her kids are older now, but she's still a mother. From the outside, her life doesn't look that different. But from the inside, everything has changed. Because she's no longer disappearing. She's no longer just a collection of roles. She's a person, with interests, with dreams, with a life that's hers. And it all started with 30 minutes a day. Here's what I want you to understand. You don't have to blow up your life to change it. You don't have to quit your job, leave your partner, or move across the country to start becoming yourself. You just have to start. And starting doesn't have to be big. It just has to be real. Think about the changes you've been waiting to make. Maybe you want to switch careers. Maybe you want to write a book. Maybe you want to get healthy, reconnect with old friends, learn a new skill, or finally pursue that dream you've been putting off for decades. And maybe the reason you haven't started is because the whole thing feels too big, too overwhelming, too impossible to do while you're still managing everything else in your life. But what if you didn't have to do the whole thing at once? What if you just had to do one thing today? Not quit your job, but spend 10 minutes researching what it would take to transition to a different field. Not write a whole book, but write one paragraph, one sentence even. Not overhaul your entire life, but take one small action that moves you in the direction of the person you want to become. That's the courage to start small. And it's far more powerful than waiting for the perfect moment to make a grand gesture. James was 54 when he realized he'd spent his entire adult life working in finance, a career he'd fallen into by accident and stayed in out of inertia. He didn't hate it, but he didn't love it either. And the thought of spending the next 10 years doing the same thing made him feel like he was suffocating. What he really wanted to do was teach. He'd always loved working with young people, mentoring interns, explaining complex ideas in simple ways. But going back to school to get a teaching credential at 54, leaving his well-paying job with no guarantee he'd even like teaching full-time, it felt insane. So James didn't do that. Instead, he started small. He signed up to volunteer as a tutor at a local community center. One night a week, 2 hours, that's it. He wasn't getting paid, he wasn't changing careers, he was just trying. Just seeing what it felt like to do the thing he thought he wanted to do. And it turned out he loved it, more than he'd loved anything in years. So he added another night. Then he started offering free financial literacy workshops on weekends. Then he began exploring online teaching platforms where he could create courses in his spare time. 3 years later, James is still working in finance, but he's also teaching. He's building something on the side. And when he's ready, when his kids are through college, when his retirement savings hit the number he needs, he'll make the full transition. But he didn't have to wait until then to start living as the person he wanted to become. He started now. Small, sustainable, real. Here's the truth about big changes. They're scary. And when you're in your 40s, 50s, or beyond, you have more to lose than you did at 25. You have financial obligations, people depending on you, a life you've built that you can't just abandon. And that's okay. You don't have to abandon it. You just have to start making space for the person you're becoming. Small steps aren't a compromise. They're a strategy. Because small steps are sustainable. They don't require you to burn down your entire life to begin. They don't require perfection. They don't require certainty. They just require courage. The courage to do one thing today that your future self will thank you for. The courage to stop waiting for the perfect moment and start where you are. The courage to believe that small actions, repeated over time, add up to something extraordinary. Think about it. What's one small thing you could do today that would move you closer to the life you actually want? Could you spend 15 minutes researching something you're curious about? Could you reach out to one person who's living the kind of life you want to live and ask them how they got there? Could you carve out 10 minutes to do something you used to love but haven't done in years? Could you wake up 30 minutes earlier to have time for yourself? Could you say no to one obligation that drains you? Could you take one tiny step toward a dream you've been afraid to pursue? You don't have to know the whole path. You don't have to have it all figured out. You just have to take the first step. and then the next one, and then the one after that. That's how Emily rebuilt her life, 30 minutes at a time. That's how James found his purpose, 2 hours a week. That's how most people who successfully reinvent themselves in midlife do it. Not in one dramatic moment, but in 1,000 small choices that no one else even sees. And here's the beautiful part. Starting small doesn't mean you're playing it safe. It means you're being smart, because small steps build momentum. They build confidence. They prove to you that change is possible, even when the big picture still feels overwhelming. Every small step you take is evidence. Evidence that you can change. Evidence that you're not stuck. Evidence that your future doesn't have to look like your past. And over time, those small steps accumulate. They compound. And one day you'll look back and realize you've traveled miles from where you started. Not because you made one giant leap, but because you kept moving. So stop waiting for the perfect moment. Stop waiting for certainty. Stop waiting for someone to give you permission or for all your fears to disappear. Start where you are. Start with what you have. Start small. Because the person you're becoming doesn't need you to have it all figured out. They just need you to begin. And today, right now, is the perfect time to take that first small step. Chapter 6. Your people will find you. Here's a truth that no one prepares you for. When you start becoming yourself, some people won't like it. The friends who've known you for 20 years might not recognize this new version of you. Your family might question your choices. Your partner might feel threatened by the changes. And some people you thought would be with you forever, will leave. And that's going to hurt. It's going to feel like failure. Like you're doing something wrong. Like maybe you should go back to being the person everyone was comfortable with. But here's what you need to understand. Losing people when you change isn't a bug. It's a feature. Because the relationships that were built on the old you, the version of yourself that was performing, pleasing, shrinking to fit, those relationships cannot survive the real you. And as painful as it is to lose them, making room for people who actually see you is worth it. Lisa was 48 when she decided to stop drinking. Not because she was an alcoholic, but because alcohol had become the center of her social life. Every gathering with friends revolved around wine. Every stressful day ended with a glass or 3. And she realized that she didn't actually like the person she became when she drank. Loud, superficial, disconnected from herself. So she quit. And almost immediately, her friendships started falling apart. The women she'd been meeting for happy hour every Friday, they stopped inviting her. "It's not the same without you drinking," they said. The couples she and her husband used to have over for dinner, the invitations dried up. Even her sister seemed annoyed. "You're being so uptight about this," she said. "It's just wine." Lisa spent 6 months feeling lonely, like she'd made a terrible mistake, like maybe she should just start drinking again so she could have her friends back. But something kept her from doing it. A small voice inside her that said, "If they only want you when you're not being yourself, are they really your people?" So Lisa stayed the course. She kept showing up as herself, sober, clear-headed, real. And slowly, something shifted. She started going to yoga classes on Friday mornings instead of happy hours on Friday nights. She met a woman there named Claire who also didn't drink, who also valued depth over noise. They started having coffee, then hiking, then real conversations about things that actually mattered. She joined a book club. She volunteered at a local animal shelter. She started showing up in different places as a different version of herself. And the people she met in those places, they got her. They saw her. They didn't need her to be anyone other than who she was. Today, Lisa's social circle looks nothing like it did 3 years ago. She lost most of her old friends. But the friends she has now, the ones she made after she started being herself, they're real. They're deep. They're the kind of people who show up when life gets hard, not just when there's wine. I spent 20 years with people who knew me, Lisa told me. Now I have people who actually understand me, and there's no comparison. Here's what happens when you start changing. You reveal who people really are, not who you hoped they were, but who they actually are. Some people will celebrate your growth. Some will feel threatened by it. Some will try to pull you back into the old version of yourself because they're not ready to change. And some will simply drift away, not out of malice, but because you're no longer on the same path. All of that is normal, and all of that is okay. Because here's the truth. You cannot grow and stay in relationships that require you to stay small. You cannot become yourself while surrounded by people who only love the performance. Something has to give, and as much as it hurts, it's better for that something to be the relationships that were never truly yours to begin with. Carlos was 51 when he decided to leave his corporate job and start his own business. He'd been talking about it for years, but his friends, the guys he'd worked with for 2 decades, always talked him out of it. "You're crazy," they'd say. "You have a good thing here. Why risk it?" And for a long time, Carlos listened, because these were his people. The guys he played golf with, the ones he grabbed beers with after work, the ones who'd been through layoffs and promotions and all the ups and downs of corporate life together. But at 51, Carlos couldn't ignore the pull anymore. He took the leap. He started his business. And almost immediately, his friendships changed. The guys stopped calling. When he did see them, they made jokes. "Oh, here comes the entrepreneur," they'd say, with just enough edge to make it sting. They didn't ask how the business was going. They didn't offer support. They acted like he'd betrayed them by leaving. Carlos felt gutted. These were his friends, or so he thought. But then something interesting happened. He started meeting other entrepreneurs, people who understood the fear, the risk, the sleepless nights, people who celebrated his courage instead of resenting it, people who asked real questions and offered real advice. And for the first time, Carlos realized his old friends weren't supporting him because his success made them feel stuck. His growth reminded them of their own fear, and instead of dealing with that, they tried to pull him back down. "I thought losing them would kill me," Carlos said. "But honestly, it set me free. Because I stopped trying to make people understand who didn't want to understand." Here's what you need to accept. Not everyone is meant to go with you into the next chapter of your life. Some people are only in your story for a season, and when that season ends, holding on to them out of loyalty or history or fear of being alone will only keep you stuck. You have to be willing to let people go, not with anger or bitterness, but with acceptance, with gratitude for what they were and peace about what they're not. Because the people who are meant for you, the ones who will truly see you and celebrate you and grow with you, they're out there, but you won't find them if you're still clinging to relationships that require you to be someone you're not. Think about your current friendships. How many of them are built on who you were, not who you are? How many of them require you to perform, to pretend, to shrink? How many of them would survive if you started being honest about what you want, what you need, what you believe? If the answer makes you uncomfortable, that's information, not judgment. Just information about whether these relationships have room for the person you're becoming. And here's the hardest part. You might have to be the one to let go first. You might have to stop showing up to gatherings that drain you. Stop pretending to care about things you don't. Stop laughing at jokes that aren't funny. Stop being who they need you to be. And when you do that, some people will fight to keep you in the old role. They'll guilt you. They'll accuse you of changing, as if that's a bad thing. They'll make you feel selfish for prioritizing yourself. But you have to hold your ground, because your life is not a supporting role in someone else's story. You're the main character in yours, and you get to decide who else gets a part. Lisa didn't try to lose her friends. She just stopped being someone she wasn't. And the friendships that couldn't survive that? They were built on a foundation that was never real to begin with. Carlos didn't abandon his old friends. He just stopped shrinking to make them comfortable, and the ones who couldn't handle that? They were never going to be there for the real him anyway. Here's what I want you to understand. Loneliness is part of transformation. There's a period, sometimes months, sometimes longer, where you're between worlds. You've let go of the old relationships, but you haven't found the new ones yet. And that in-between space is hard. You'll question yourself. You'll wonder if you made a mistake. You'll be tempted to go back to the old friendships, the old version of yourself, just to stop feeling so alone. But if you can sit with that loneliness, if you can trust that it's temporary, something beautiful will happen. The right people will start showing up. Not because you're searching for them, but because you're finally visible. You're finally being yourself. And the people who resonate with that version of you, they'll find you. Lisa found Claire at yoga. Carlos found his entrepreneur friends at networking events. But it wasn't the place that mattered. It was the fact that they were showing up as themselves. And when you do that, when you stop performing and start being, you send out a signal, a frequency. And the people on that same frequency, they'll hear you. Your people will find you. But first, you have to become findable. And that means letting go of the ones who only knew the mask. It's scary. It's painful. But it's also the only way to build relationships that are real, that are deep, that are built on who you actually are, not who you used to pretend to be. So if you're in that in-between space right now, if you've started changing and the people around you are pulling away, know this: you're not doing it wrong. You're doing it right. The loneliness is temporary. The freedom is forever. And your people are already on their way. Chapter 7. What if you fail? Spoiler, you won't. Let me tell you about a woman who failed spectacularly. Her name was Martha Stewart. In 2004, at the age of 63, Martha went to prison for insider trading. Her business empire, the one she'd built from scratch, the one that had made her a household name, collapsed. Her brand was tarnished. Her reputation was in shambles. By all conventional measures, she had failed. Publicly, dramatically, irreversibly. Most people at 63 facing that kind of fall would have given up, would have retired quietly, maybe written a memoir, spent the rest of their lives managing the damage. Martha didn't do that. She served her time, and when she got out, she rebuilt. Not the same empire, but a different one. She reinvented herself, partnered with Snoop Dogg of all people, became relevant to a whole new generation, turned her failure into a comeback story that's even more impressive than her original success. Today, Martha Stewart is worth hundreds of millions of dollars. She's more visible, more influential, and arguably more interesting than she ever was before her fall. So did she fail? Or did she just hit a detour on the way to becoming someone better? Here's what I want you to understand. At 40, 50, 60, or beyond, the fear of failure feels bigger than it did when you were young. Because you have more to lose, more responsibilities, more people depending on you, more years invested in the life you've already built. This fear keeps you stuck. It keeps you from trying anything new, from taking any risks, from making any changes. Because what if you fail? But here's the truth that changes everything. Failure at this age is not the same as failure at 25. At 25, if you fail, you might feel like you've wasted your potential. But at 50, you've already lived. You've already succeeded at some things and failed at others. You've already survived. You have perspective, and that perspective changes what failure even means. Because failure, when you're older, isn't the end of your story. It's just data, information, feedback, a chance to course correct, to try something different, to learn something you didn't know before. And the wisdom you've accumulated makes you far less likely to fail catastrophically than you would have been when you were young and reckless. Tom was 55 when he decided to leave his job in sales and open a woodworking shop. He'd been building furniture as a hobby for years, and he loved it. But turning it into a business was terrifying. What if no one bought his furniture? What if he couldn't make enough money to support himself? What if he failed and had to go back to sales, humiliated and broke? Those fears almost stopped him. But Tom made a decision. He would give himself 2 years. If it worked, great. If it didn't, he'd go back to sales. He wasn't betting his entire future on one roll of the dice. He was experimenting. Year 1 was hard. He barely made enough to cover his expenses. Year 2 was better, but still tight. And by the end of year 2, Tom had to face the truth. His woodworking business wasn't going to replace his old income. So did he fail? Most people would say yes. But here's what Tom said. I didn't fail. I learned. I learned that I love making furniture more than I love making money. I learned that I can live on less than I thought. And I learned that there's a middle path between all in and giving up. Tom didn't close his shop. He just scaled it back. He took on some freelance sales work to supplement his income. And he kept making furniture. Not as his full-time job, but as something meaningful that brought him joy. People think failure means you have to quit, Tom said. But sometimes failure just means you have to adjust. And that's not the same thing. Here's what society won't tell you. Failure is not binary. It's not you succeed or you fail. Life is far more nuanced than that. You can try something and discover it doesn't work the way you hoped. And that's not failure. That's wisdom. You can take a risk and end up somewhere different than you planned. And that's not failure. That's growth. You can pursue a dream and realize halfway through that it's not what you actually wanted. And that's not failure. That's self-knowledge. Failure, the catastrophic kind that people fear, almost never happens. What happens instead is that you try, you learn, and you adapt. And each time you do that, you become more resilient, more confident, more yourself. Victoria was 49 when she left her corporate job to become a life coach. She'd been thinking about it for years. She got certified. She built a website. She started posting on social media. And for the first 6 months, nothing happened. No clients, no income, just crickets. Victoria felt like a fool. She'd left a stable job for this? She'd spent thousands of dollars on training and marketing for nothing? She was ready to give up and go crawling back to corporate life. But before she did, she asked herself one question. What did I actually learn from this? She learned that her messaging wasn't clear. She learned that she was trying to help everyone instead of focusing on a specific niche. She learned that social media wasn't her strength, but one-on-one conversations were. So she adjusted. She clarified who she helped, women over 40 navigating major life transitions. She stopped trying to build a social media following and started networking in person. She offered free workshops at local community centers just to meet people. And slowly, it started working. Not in the way she'd originally imagined, but in a way that felt more authentic, more sustainable, more her. 3 years later, Victoria has a thriving coaching practice. But when I asked her if she ever felt like she'd failed in those early months, she laughed. "I didn't fail," she said. "I fumbled. And fumbling is just part of learning. The only way I would have failed is if I'd quit before I figured it out." Here's the mindset shift I want you to make. Stop thinking of failure as the opposite of success. Start thinking of it as part of the process. Every person you admire, every success story you've heard, every person who's built something meaningful, they all failed along the way. They just didn't let that stop them. Martha Stewart went to prison and came back stronger. Colonel Sanders was rejected over 1,000 times before someone said yes to his chicken recipe. J.K. Rowling was a single mother on welfare when she wrote Harry Potter. She was rejected by 12 publishers before one finally took a chance on her book. These people didn't succeed despite failure. They succeeded because they kept going after failure. And here's the secret. At your age, you have something those people didn't have when they started: experience. You've already failed at things. You've already survived disappointment. You've already proven to yourself that you can pick yourself up and keep going. So what's the worst that can happen if you try something new and it doesn't work out? You'll have spent some time and maybe some money on something that didn't pan out. You'll have learned what doesn't work. You'll have gathered information that makes your next attempt smarter. That's not failure. That's education. And here's what won't happen. You won't die. You won't lose your identity. You won't erase all the good you've already done in your life. You'll just be a person who tried something and learned from it. That's not scary. That's brave. Think about it. What would you try if you knew failure wasn't the end of the world? Would you start that business? Write that book? Go back to school? Change careers? Move to a new city? End a relationship that's been dead for years? What would you do if you stopped seeing failure as a catastrophe and started seeing it as feedback? The answer to that question is probably the thing you should be doing right now. The only real failure is living your whole life afraid to try, afraid to risk, afraid to be seen attempting something that might not work. That's the failure that actually costs you, not the attempt that doesn't pan out, the absence of the attempt, the dream you never pursued, the chance you never took. Tom tried woodworking full-time and it didn't work exactly as planned. But he didn't fail. He found a hybrid model that works for his life. Victoria struggled for months before her coaching business took off. But she didn't fail. She refined her approach until it worked. Martha Stewart went to prison and rebuilt an empire. She didn't fail. She evolved. And you won't fail either. You'll try, you'll learn, you'll adjust, you'll try again. And one day, you'll look back and realize that all those failures were just stepping stones to becoming who you were always meant to be. So stop letting the fear of failure keep you small. Stop using "what if I fail" as an excuse not to try. Because the real question isn't, what if you fail? The real question is, what if you don't try and spend the rest of your life wondering what could have been? That's the outcome you should actually be afraid of. So try. Fumble, learn, adjust, try again. That's not failure. That's living. And you deserve to live. Chapter 8. Finding your why again. When you're young, life gives you a built-in purpose. You're supposed to go to school, get a job, build a career, get married maybe, have kids maybe. Check the boxes, climb the ladder, follow the script. And for a while, that script works. It gives you direction. It gives you goals. It gives you a reason to get out of bed in the morning. But somewhere around 40, 50 or beyond, something shifts. The kids grow up and don't need you the same way. The career you spent decades building stops feeling meaningful. The goals you were chasing suddenly feel empty. And you're left standing there, asking a question you never thought you'd have to answer. What's the point of all this? What am I actually doing with my life? What matters to me now? This isn't a crisis. This is a reckoning. And it's one of the most important moments of your life. Because for the first time, maybe ever, you have the chance to define your own purpose. Not the one society handed you. Not the one your parents wanted for you. Not the one you fell into by accident. But your purpose. The thing that makes you come alive. The thing that gives your life meaning. Daniel was 53 when he realized he didn't know why he was doing any of it anymore. He'd spent 30 years in corporate finance. He'd made good money. He'd climbed the ranks. He'd provided for his family, saved for retirement, done everything he was supposed to do. But when he sat at his desk in the morning, staring at spreadsheets and earnings reports, he felt nothing. No excitement, no purpose. Just the hollow routine of going through the motions. His kids were grown, his mortgage was paid off, his retirement account was solid. And he realized he'd spent 3 decades building a life that looked successful on a paper, but felt meaningless in his soul. So he asked himself a question he'd never asked before. If money wasn't an issue, if I could do anything with the next chapter of my life, what would it be? At first, he had no answer. He'd been so focused on what he was supposed to do that he'd never stopped to think about what he actually wanted to do. But he sat with the question. And slowly, an answer emerged. He wanted to teach, not in a classroom necessarily, but to mentor, to help young people figure out their careers, their finances, their lives, to give them the guidance he'd never had. So Daniel started volunteering. He reached out to a local community college and offered to lead free financial literacy workshops. He started mentoring students one-on-one. And for the first time in years, he felt like what he was doing mattered. I realized I'd been chasing success for so long that I forgot to ask what success actually meant to me, he told me. Turns out it's not money. It's impact. It's knowing that what I do today made someone's life a little better. Here's what most people don't understand about purpose. It's not something you find. It's something you create. You don't wake up one day and magically discover your purpose written in the stars. You build it through choices, through experiments, through asking yourself hard questions and being willing to change direction when the answers don't align with the life you're living. And here's the beautiful thing about finding your why in midlife. You have clarity. You have experience. You know what doesn't matter. You've already tried the things that didn't fulfill you. And that makes it so much easier to identify what does. When you're 25, you're still figuring out who you are. But at 50, you know. You know what lights you up. You know what drains you. You know the difference between what you think you should want and what you actually want. That's not a disadvantage. That's a superpower. Sophia was 47 when she realized she'd spent her entire adult life taking care of other people. Her parents, her husband, her kids. She'd been the responsible one, the reliable one, the one everyone leaned on. And she'd loved it. For a long time, that role gave her purpose, made her feel needed, made her feel like she mattered. But now her kids were teenagers, becoming more independent every day. Her parents had passed. Her husband was self-sufficient. And Sophia woke up one morning and thought, who am I when I'm not taking care of someone? It was terrifying. Because for the first time in her life, she had to ask herself, what do I want? Not what does my family need, not what's expected of me, but what do I, Sophia, actually want? She didn't have an answer. So she started trying things. She signed up for a painting class, something she'd always been curious about, but never had time for. She started reading books she'd been meaning to read for years. She took long walks by herself and let her mind wander. And in the quiet space she created for herself, something started to emerge. She realized she loved creating, not just painting, but making things with her hands, cooking elaborate meals not out of obligation, but out of joy, gardening, writing. So Sophia started a blog about simple, intentional living. Nothing fancy, just her thoughts on creating beauty in everyday life. At first, no one read it, but she didn't care, because it was hers. It was something she was doing not because someone needed her to, but because it brought her joy. 2 years later, Sophia's blog has a small but devoted following. She's written an ebook. She started offering online workshops. And more than any of that, she has a purpose that's entirely her own. I thought my purpose was to take care of people, she told me. But I realized that was just one purpose for one season. Now my purpose is to create, to inspire, to show people that it's never too late to start something new. Here's what I want you to understand. Your purpose doesn't have to be grand. It doesn't have to change the world. It doesn't have to make you famous or rich or admired. It just has to be yours. It just has to make you feel like your life has meaning. For Daniel, that's mentoring young people. For Sophia, it's creating and inspiring. For someone else, it might be volunteering at an animal shelter, or learning to play the guitar, or traveling to places they've always dreamed of seeing, or simply being the kind of grandparent who shows up and listens. Your purpose is whatever makes you feel alive. Whatever makes you feel like you're contributing something to the world, even if the world is just the people closest to you. Your purpose will change. It's not static. It's not something you figure out once and then you're done. It evolves as you evolve. The purpose that drove you in your 20s won't be the same as the one that drives you in your 50s. And that's okay. That's not failure. That's growth. Think about it. What gave your life meaning 10 years ago? Is it still giving you meaning today? If the answer is no, that's not a problem. That's an opportunity to ask yourself, what matters to me now? What do I want the next chapter of my life to be about? Maybe it's about legacy, about leaving something behind for the people who come after you. Maybe it's about freedom, about finally doing the things you've been putting off for decades. Maybe it's about connection, about deepening your relationships with the people who matter most. Maybe it's about service, about giving back, about making a difference, about using what you've learned to help others. There's no right answer. There's only your answer. And finding that answer requires honesty. It requires you to stop living on autopilot and start asking the hard questions. It requires you to be willing to let go of the purposes that no longer fit and embrace new ones that do. Daniel didn't quit his job overnight. Sophia didn't abandon her family. They just added something. Something that gave their lives new meaning. Something that made them feel like they were building towards something instead of just maintaining. And you can do the same. You don't have to blow up your life to find your why. You just have to create space for it. Space to explore. Space to ask questions. Space to try new things and see what resonates. Because here's the beautiful truth. Your best years aren't behind you. They're ahead of you. And the purpose that will drive those years is waiting for you to discover it. So stop waiting. Start asking. Start trying. Start building. Because a life with purpose is a life worth living. And you deserve to know what it feels like to wake up every day and think, this is what I'm here for. Not the purpose someone else gave you, but the one you chose. Chapter 9. Wake up excited again. When was the last time you woke up in the morning and felt excited about your day? Not stressed, not obligated, not resigned to another round of the same routine, but genuinely, honestly excited. For too many people, the answer is, I don't remember. Somewhere along the way, life stopped being something you looked forward to and started being something you just endured. You stopped waking up with anticipation and started waking up with dread. Or worse, with nothing. Just the flat, gray numbness of going through the motions. And you've told yourself that's just what happens when you get older. That excitement is for kids. That at your age, you're supposed to be practical, responsible, realistic. That waking up excited about life is a luxury you can't afford. But what if I told you that's a lie? What if excitement isn't something you outgrow, but something you've forgotten? What if it's still there, waiting for you, buried under years of routine and obligation and the quiet belief that your life is already set? Here's the truth. You can wake up excited again. Not every single day. Life is still life, and some days will always be hard. But more days than you think, more days than you're experiencing now. But it requires something radical. It requires you to remember what joy feels like, and then to make space for it. Think back to when you were younger. Not a kid necessarily, but maybe in your 20s or 30s. What made you excited then? Maybe it was travel, the thrill of seeing new places, experiencing new cultures, feeling alive in unfamiliar surroundings. Maybe it was learning, taking a class, reading about something new, getting lost in ideas that expanded your mind. Maybe it was creating, writing, painting, building something with your hands, making something that didn't exist before you made it. Maybe it was connection, deep conversations with friends, falling in love, feeling seen and understood by another human being. Maybe it was adventure, trying new things, taking risks, not knowing how it would turn out and doing it anyway. Now ask yourself, when was the last time you did any of those things? When was the last time you went somewhere new, not for work, not for obligation, but just because you wanted to see it? When was the last time you learned something for no reason other than curiosity? When was the last time you created something, not for money, not for approval, but just for the joy of making it? When was the last time you had a conversation that wasn't about logistics or responsibilities or what needs to get done? When was the last time you tried something you'd never done before, just to see what would happen? If you can't remember, that's not because those things aren't available to you anymore. It's because you stopped making space for them. You got busy. You got responsible. You convinced yourself that excitement was something you'd get back to someday, when life calmed down, when you had more time, when you'd earned the right to enjoy yourself. But someday never comes. Life never calms down, and you can't earn the right to feel joy. Joy is your birthright. It's been there all along. You just forgot how to access it. Here's what I want you to do. Start small. Don't try to overhaul your entire life. Just find one thing that used to make you excited and do it again. Maybe you used to love hiking. Go on a hike. Not a long one. Not a difficult one. Just walk in nature and remember what it felt like to move your body in a place that made you feel alive. Maybe you used to love reading fiction. Pick up a novel. Not self-help, not business, not something useful. Just a story that transports you somewhere else. Maybe you used to love cooking elaborate meals. Make something new. Something you've never tried before. Something that requires you to be present, to engage, to create. Maybe you used to love music. Go to a concert. Or just put on headphones and listen, really listen, to an album you love. Do one thing. Just one. Not because it's productive. Not because it will make you a better person. Not because it will help you achieve some goal. Do it because it makes you feel alive. And then pay attention to how you feel. Notice the shift. Notice the small spark of energy, of curiosity, of joy that you'd forgotten was even possible. Because here's the secret. Joy is cumulative. One small moment of excitement leads to another. One small act of aliveness reminds you that you're still capable of feeling that way. And over time, those small moments add up to a life that feels different. Not perfect, not problem-free, but alive. You don't need to wait for retirement to start enjoying your life. You don't need to wait for your kids to grow up, or your career to stabilize, or your responsibilities to lighten. You can start today, right now, with one small choice that reminds you what it feels like to wake up excited. Because you deserve more than just getting through the day. You deserve more than just existing. You deserve to live, to feel, to be present for your own life instead of just managing it. And the person you're becoming, the person on the other side of all these changes, needs that joy, needs that aliveness, needs to know that life isn't just about responsibilities and routines. Life is also about beauty, about wonder, about the small, perfect moments that make you think, this is what I'm here for. So find one thing, one small thing, and let yourself feel excited about it. Because your best years aren't behind you. They're ahead of you. And they're waiting for you to wake up. Chapter 10. Your story isn't over. It's just beginning. There's a woman I want to tell you about. Her name is Grace, and when I met her, she was 60 years old, and standing at a crossroads she never expected to face. Grace had spent the last 40 years of her life doing everything she was supposed to do. She'd raised 3 kids, been married for 35 years to a man who was a good provider, but emotionally distant, worked as a school librarian in a job she liked well enough, but never truly loved. She'd checked all the boxes, followed all the rules, built a life that looked stable and responsible from the outside. But at 60, after her youngest child moved across the country and her husband retired to play golf every day, Grace woke up one morning and realized something that terrified her. She had absolutely no idea who she was. Not Grace the mom, not Grace the wife, not Grace the librarian. Just Grace. The person underneath all those roles, the woman she'd been before, she became everyone else's everything. And for the first time in her life, she had time. Time to figure it out, to ask herself what she wanted instead of what everyone else needed. Time to start living as herself instead of as a collection of responsibilities that had slowly erased the person she'd once been. Most people would look at Grace and think it was too late, that 60 was too old to start over, that she'd already lived her whole life And what was the point of changing now? But Grace didn't see it that way. "I'm 60, she told me, her voice steady and certain. "And if I'm lucky, I've got another 30 years ahead of me. That's 3 decades. That's enough time to live an entirely different life. Enough time to become someone I've never been before." So Grace started small. She started taking Spanish lessons, something she'd always wanted to do but never had time for. She joined a community theater group and auditioned for a play, stepping onto a stage for the first time in her life. She started traveling, not to all-inclusive resorts, but to small towns in Central America where she could practice her Spanish and meet local people and experience life in a way she'd never allowed herself before. And at 65, Grace did something that shocked everyone who knew her. She moved to Guatemala, not permanently, but for 6 months out of every year. She volunteers at a local school teaching English to children, learning to salsa dance with women her age who have lived entirely different lives than hers. She wakes up every morning and feels excited about what the day might bring. "I spent 60 years being who I thought I was supposed to be," Grace told me, and there was no bitterness in her voice, only a quiet joy. "Now I'm spending the rest of my life being who I want to be. And honestly, these are the best years I've ever had." Grace's story isn't unique. It's not even rare. But it's a story we don't hear often enough because society has convinced us that life is a countdown. That you peak in your 20s or 30s, and after that, it's all downhill. That by the time you're 50 or 60 or 70, your story is basically over and you're just running out the clock. But that's a lie. And it's a lie that's costing you the best years of your life. Because here's the truth. Your story isn't over. It's not even close to over. And the chapter you're about to write, the one where you finally become yourself, might be the best one yet. Think about it. How many years do you have left? If you're 50, you could easily have 40 more years ahead of you. That's almost as long as you've already lived. That's enough time to learn a new language, write a book, build a business, fall in love again, travel to places you've only dreamed about. If you're 60, you could have 30 years. That's longer than most people's entire careers. Enough time to make a real difference in the world, to leave a legacy that matters, to experience things you've never allowed yourself to experience before. If you're 70, you could still have 20 years. And 20 years is enough time to become someone entirely new. To finally live without the weight of other people's expectations. To discover what brings you joy instead of what brings you approval. Your story isn't over. But it will be over if you keep living like it is. If you keep telling yourself that you're too old, it's too late. Your best years are behind you. Because when you believe that, you stop. You stop trying, stop growing, stop living. And you spend the rest of your years just existing, waiting for the end. But what if you didn't do that? What if you looked at the years ahead of you and saw possibility instead of decline? What if you saw them as a gift? A chance to finally live as yourself. Without the pressure to perform, without the need to please everyone else, without the fear of getting it wrong. Here's what I want you to understand. The person you're becoming is more important than the person you've been. Yes, you've lived a lot of years. Yes, you've made choices you can't undo. Yes, there are dreams you didn't chase, paths you didn't take, versions of yourself you never became. But none of that means your story is over. It just means you have more data, more experience, more wisdom, more clarity about what actually matters. And that makes you better equipped to write the next chapter than you've ever been before. You don't have to waste time figuring out who you are anymore. You know who you are. You just have to give yourself permission to be that person. You don't have to try to impress anyone. You've already lived, already proven yourself. Now you get to live for you. You don't have to be afraid of failure. You've already failed at things and survived. You know that failure isn't the end. It's just feedback. This is your advantage. This is your power, and it's available to you right now. So what are you going to do with it? Are you going to spend the next 20, 30, 40 years playing it safe? Staying small? Living the same routine over and over until it's actually over? Or are you going to take a risk? Try something new? Become someone you've never been before? Are you going to keep waiting for permission? For the perfect moment? For certainty? Things that will never come? Or are you going to give yourself permission right now to start living the life you've been putting off? Because here's the truth. You don't have forever. None of us do. But you have today. And you have tomorrow. And you have however many days come after that. And each one of those days is a choice. A choice to live or to wait. A choice to become yourself or to keep playing the role. A choice to start or to keep waiting for some day that never arrives. Grace chose to start at 60. And now, at 67, she's living a life she couldn't have imagined when she was stuck in the routine of being everyone else's everything. You can do the same. Not in the same way. Your path will be different. Your dreams will be different. Your version of starting over will be uniquely yours. But you can start. You can choose today to stop living like your story is over and start writing the chapter you've been waiting your whole life to write. Your story isn't over. It's just beginning. And the person you're becoming is waiting for you to take that first step. So take it. Today. Right now. Because your best years aren't behind you. They're ahead of you. And they start the moment you decide to live. Conclusion. Begin. So here we are, at the end of this book. But not at the end of your story. I want you to take a moment and think about where you were when you started reading. What were you feeling? What question were you asking yourself? What fear were you carrying? Maybe it was the fear that it's too late, that you've missed your chance, that the best years of your life are behind you and all that's left is decline and regret. Maybe it was the fear of not knowing who you are anymore, of feeling lost in a life that looks good on paper but feels empty inside. Maybe it was the fear of change, of risking what you've built, of disappointing the people who expect you to stay exactly as you are. Whatever brought you here, I hope you're leaving with something different, not certainty. Life doesn't give us certainty, but hope. The kind of hope that doesn't ignore reality but sees possibility in it. The kind of hope that says, I can start right now, right where I am. Because that's what this whole book has been about. Not some dramatic transformation where you blow up your life and start from scratch. Not some unrealistic promise that if you just follow 10 steps, everything will be perfect. But the simple, radical truth that it's never too late to become yourself. You've spent years, maybe decades, being who you thought you were supposed to be. Playing the roles, meeting the expectations, shrinking to fit into a life that someone else designed for you. And maybe that worked for a while. Maybe it even felt good. But somewhere along the way, you realized, this isn't mine. This life, this version of me, it's not who I am. And that realization is where everything changes. Not when you have all the answers. Not when you figured out the perfect plan. But when you admit that the life you're living isn't the life you want. When you give yourself permission to want something different. When you take one small step toward becoming the person you've always been underneath all the performance. You've met people in this book who did exactly that. Jane, who left teaching at 47 to build a life that was hers. Michael, who asked himself at 52, "Who am I without my role?" and found an answer that set him free. Sarah, who gave herself permission at 44 to choose herself instead of waiting for someone else to approve. Grace, who started over at 60 and is living the best years of her life. These people aren't special. They're not braver or smarter or luckier than you. They just made a choice to stop waiting, a choice to start small, a choice to believe that their story wasn't over, even when everything around them said it was. And you can make that same choice today, right now. You don't need to have it all figured out. You don't need a perfect plan. You don't need anyone's permission. You just need to take one step, one small action that moves you closer to the person you want to be. Maybe it's waking up 30 minutes earlier to have time for yourself. Maybe it's saying no to something that drains you. Maybe it's starting that thing you've been putting off for years. Maybe it's just admitting to yourself what you actually want, instead of what you think you should want. One step. That's all it takes to begin. And here's the beautiful part. You don't have to do it alone. The people who are meant for you, the ones who will see you and celebrate you and walk with you, they're out there. And they'll find you the moment you start being yourself. So this is where we part ways. But it's not an ending. It's a beginning. Your beginning. The one you've been waiting for. The one where you finally give yourself permission to live instead of just exist. To feel instead of just endure. To become who you are instead of who you thought you were supposed to be. Your best years aren't behind you, they're ahead of you. And they start today. So begin. Take that first step, and then take another, and another. Because your story isn't over. It's just beginning. And I can't wait to see who you become.